Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our latest Webinar Wednesday, sponsored by NUCA's sustaining partner, Ferguson Waterworks. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping for attendees. Today's webinar will be recorded. It will be available on NUCA's YouTube channel and via our webinar webpage, both of which can be accessed via nuca.com. All participants are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute and unmute themselves. Questions will be asked at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, you can submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I'll read them at the conclusion of our discussion. Now let's get started. Our September webinar will provide an overview of the purpose and function of green stormwater infrastructure. NUCA sustaining partner Ferguson Waterworks expert Chris Bogdan, NGICP, will discuss the strategy his company uses to manage wet weather and identify in this 30-minute webinar a number of common challenges found in these assets post-construction. Chris will give some practical advice to attendees on which upgrades and improvements to overcome these challenges can be addressed by using the planning and design process. Chris is the manager for the Southern United States for Ferguson Waterworks Green Stormwater Infrastructure Division. Chris has worked on green infrastructure projects throughout the southern U.S. related to water quality and conservation. Chris, I turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much, Bob, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. I appreciate you joining us to learn about green infrastructure, one of my favorite topics of conversation. Again, thanks for the introduction. My name is Chris Bogdan, and a little bit about me. I am a born and raised Florida boy. This is me down in the Keys. I love water. I love being on water. I've been around water my entire life, and I'm so passionate about protecting this natural resource for future generations. So I get a little fired up when I get to share stories about how I think we can do it better. To give you some background, I just want you to know kind of where we come from. Ferguson Waterworks, we are a stormwater distribution company. We sell products, and we sell anything you can think of in the water industry. And I think that's really important because as we talk about collaboration, which we're going to talk about today, I think it's really important to have that product expert near you, involved in your project, so that when a challenge comes up that can't be solved with something natural, there's products out there that we can use to solve some of those challenges. And as Bob mentioned, I work specifically in the green infrastructure space. So our products are kind of categorized into these five categories of space efficient storage, alternative or porous surfaces, which I'm going to talk about today, filters and screens for pretreatment. I'm going to talk about that today. We also do medio and biofiltration for cleaning stormwater, managing volume, and then something really cool that we've been getting involved in are urban landscapes, essentially creating healthy places for urban trees and plants to thrive. So again, we're only going to focus on a couple of these categories today, and we work with cities and counties, which, you know, many folks here are from all over the country. Normally, green infrastructure starts with a city or county dabbling in this space, but we also work with private developers. And they're two very different audiences with very different goals. So we bring a lot of experience to the table to have these conversations with you. Again, we support these projects. So Ferguson has an engineering services team. We don't sign and seal anything. But if you see some things you like today, or there's a lot of things I'm not going to cover today, we can technically support those things for your landscape architects, your municipalities, your civil engineers. We also do job site support. Very, very important. We do not install anything. But man, I tell you, I just got done with a pre-construction meeting today for one of the products we're going to talk about, and we're there to help. We're there to help answer questions and make sure these things go in right. They got to go in right to function long term. And again, we've learned a lot being in the field with these contractors. And last but not least, we support municipalities. As you start to dabble into this green infrastructure space, or maybe if you've already been doing it for years and years, we've got tools and tricks and tips to help you get it done. Love these public outreach placards where you tell the community what you're doing, because sometimes these things are new and they look a little funky. So we come with a lot of experience working on projects, and we're going to bring some of that to you today. Green infrastructure. As I start these talks, I always like to kind of start with, what is green infrastructure? Well, on the left-hand side of the screen is gray infrastructure. It rains, you want to get water into a drain, into a pipe, and typically into a pond as fast as you can. Green infrastructure is different, right? It says, let's mimic nature and how it used to be. Before we built on everything, we want to capture that land on property. We want to try and soak it into the ground, but ultimately, we really want to slow the flow of water down. So I think one of the common misconceptions of green infrastructure is, I have bad soils, I can't do green infrastructure. Not true. We're ultimately just trying to slow down the flow of water. And we can do that even if your soils are bad. So keep that in mind when you're talking about sites. And this stuff's important. Why is it important? Well, again, on the left-hand side of the screen, before we built anything, when it rains, about 10% of the water that hit the ground left the site. Well, in these urban environments where we see it more and more, build, about 55% of the water that hits the ground runs off downstream. That means it's going downstream into a water body, it's going into a conveyance system. So it creates a lot of problems. And that's why I think green infrastructure is important, is we want to get back to basics. Another big thing, aging infrastructure. Think about your infrastructure in your area. Pipes were put in the ground 50, 75, 100 years ago. They were put there to serve a certain population, a certain amount of impervious area. I don't know about where you live, but everywhere I travel, the population's growing, which means we're building more and more, but guess what hasn't changed? The pipe size. So we're trying to put 3 times water, 10 times more water in a pipe that just can't take it. And folks, that's why we're starting to see flooding in areas where we never saw flooding before, with those afternoon downfalls, rainstorms, because the infrastructure just can't take it. Green infrastructure gives you an opportunity to change that. Do it in all kinds of different ways. I love this graphic. This comes from an interesting place. The University of Arkansas has a great LID manual. It's free and it's online. Check it out. But essentially, all this beautiful streetscape is stormwater management. Pervious surfaces, tree wells, rain gardens. There's so many different methods that you can utilize besides a pipe and a drain. And I think this is a better way to go about doing things. All these can be added without digging up a street, right? Which is great. So promote green infrastructure. I think you can kind of start to tell I'm passionate about green infrastructure. What's getting in the way? Well, I think it's important to talk about these things, right? A lot of times you hear people say it's too expensive. Well, this is a paver. It's a paver that's beautiful, and it operates like asphalt or concrete. Here's a paver that's beautiful, but it lets water go down through it. Is there really that much difference, right? Too expensive to maintain. I encourage all of you to look at the gardens in any retail center you go in. There's a big curb around it, and it's beautifully landscaped. This is a rain garden. Landscaping looks the same. You got to weed it, you got to mow it, you got to trim it, but that serves as a stormwater asset. Are they really that different? And this is my favorite. Too expensive to repair. When the pipe breaks, let the fun begin. Rip up the road, tear down businesses, make mad drivers like me. Green infrastructure assets are usually at the surface. If something goes wrong with them, they're pretty easy to repair and fix, and you don't have to go tearing stuff up. So I would encourage folks to think a little differently about green infrastructure. I don't think it's as bad as some people make it out to be. And I love this. My old dad used to tell me this growing up. You're nuts if you think you can keep doing the same thing over and over again and get a different result. Bigger pipes aren't equaling less flooding or less nutrient pollution downstream. So I would encourage everyone to start to embrace the green infrastructure journey. I think it's a much, much better way to manage water. And it's important. It's important for municipalities for several different reasons. Number one, it's gonna limit localized flooding, afternoon storms and things of that nature. It's proven to do that. It's going to reduce nutrient discharges. Remember what I said, when you put water into a pipe and that pipe goes into a surface water body, it's bringing all the nutrients with it. If we can keep that water on our site, we're not putting the nutrients downstream, and you're not seeing algal blooms and other bad things that go on with dirty water. Recharge aquifers. This is really important in areas like where I live in Florida. Recharge aquifers, it helps push out some of that sea level pressure that you get from obviously the oceans. I love this one. Reduce pressure on municipalities to clean other people's runoff. Think back to what we looked at. 55% of the water that hits a private site becomes a municipality's problem. What if we could reduce that by 5 or 10%? Would that be important to that municipality? And finally, money, folks. If you think about traditional stormwater management, you have a lot of retention ponds. Those retention ponds aren't generating any revenue, but if we can get rid of that, fold the stormwater management into the landscape, now we can increase tax revenues for municipalities. Developers are totally different, and they care about different things. And we got to think about that when we're designing sites. First and foremost, there's increased nutrient reduction requirements all over the country. Green infrastructure can help them achieve those goals. Many cities and counties are actually implementing green infrastructure manuals. Well, now I'm a developer. I've never done this before. How do I do it? It's expensive. They got to be thinking about that and put it to use. in good ways. They're building on the worst sites. You know, if you think about it, if I came to a new city, I'd want to build on the highest land with the best soils. Those are all gone. So there's some challenges built into them doing, oops, I'm sorry, you're seeing stuff come up there. Sorry, there's some challenges built around what type of land they're building on. More buildable space. At the end of the day, folks, developers want to put as much building and parking as they can on their piece of property. A pond gets in the way of doing that. Green infrastructure can help. And then last but not least, public perception is changing. You know, if you think back to that graphic I showed of that beautiful street with shady trees, and people want that. You know, a lot of these rain gardens have pollinator plants in them. So you start to see wildlife. Beautiful. People are starting to want that, and developers are answering that demand by creating more green infrastructure stuff. So that's all my stuff now. We're going to really dive into some case studies, as I would call them. So again, we work with municipalities all over the country. This division was really born in the Northeast. So we've done a lot of work in the Northeast with these groups. And the one thing that all these people have in common, great green infrastructure programs. Some have been around for years and years. Some have only been around for a few. They all care about maintenance. They all recognize that we must perform maintenance, design with maintenance in mind to make sure these assets perform and last long term. So we're going to look at a couple different municipalities today. First and foremost, we'll look at Philadelphia and their Green Streets program. We're also going to look at New York City, and we're going to look at a couple different things with New York, which is kind of fun for me. So we'll dive right into, you know, we've got two different municipalities, something to think about when you're designing these green infrastructure projects. Number one, there's a lot of variables, right? No two cities are the same. How big's the site? What kind of space is available? Are there pollutants of concern? If you're dealing with grates or inlets, which we're going to talk about, what do those look like? And then slopes can create a lot of water velocity. Those can create challenges as well. So again, you got to think about these things. And the other thing you got to think about, maintenance, we're going to talk about today, budgets, equipment. Does your city or county have the ability to maintain these things with the equipment, or do they have the money set aside to do it? Do you want these things to look pretty? Are they functional? Or are they just get the job done? And I don't know what this means, winter consideration. In Florida, it only gets to be down to about 60 degrees. So I don't know, but I hear there's snow in other places, and you got to factor that in. So again, you know, joking aside, that's always something you got to be thinking about too in your areas. What are we going to do when it snows or it ices? Okay, so no two cities are the same. Keep that in mind as we dive into Philadelphia. Unbelievable Green Streets program, unbelievable, always thinking about green infrastructure. And I think it's a great program for a couple of different reasons. Number one, they've got a great variety of options to use. They understand and budget for maintenance, and everybody's involved, which you're about to hear the story I'm going to tell now. So there's a ton of collaboration. But the real reason why it's successful, folks, is because maintenance is always driving design. They're always thinking about it. So what we went to work, what I'm going to talk to you today is this Philadelphia Green Inlet series. So they have a ton of drains throughout their old city, and they got to keep sediment, debris, trash, and things like that out of the drains, out of the conveyance system. So they got with us at Ferguson and a bunch of other people and said, hey, we want to update how we're approaching this. And this is really my favorite and the one where it started. So they've got these interesting drains all around the city. They've got a very small feed throat that you can see. And so all the dirt, debris, trash, sediment comes into these things. What they were doing is, you can see this little grate here, basically the whole length of this opening, they put this little rectangular filter behind it. Makes tons of sense. Dirty stuff comes in, collects it all in that container. Maintenance would go out to the site and go, oh, this thing's full, time to clean it out. So they'd pop the manhole, they'd reach down in there, they'd pop this little guy off of there, and then they would turn it sideways to pull it out of the manhole, and all the garbage fell back down into the hole. The maintenance guys are going, why do we even have these things in here if every time I service them, I dump half the stuff back in? Doesn't make sense. They cared, and they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to lay in the street with our feet in the middle of the road, and we're going to reach through that hole, and we're going to just take everything out by hand. So dangerous. So the city said, we got to do something about this. Let's design something different. So you're seeing some iterations over here, and what ultimately came to be was this guy, right? So this actually sits in line with that manhole cover. There's a little flume that directs all the flow into this device. And notice it's a filter bag, it's a fabric, okay? So it's relatively inexpensive to replace when they wear out. And I also want you to notice some color differences here. Really dense here, very small openings. Bigger here, bigger openings. Collaboration, remember I talked about that? So maintenance said, you know what? We don't want to collect fine sediments. We recognize that's a problem, but when we got to pull these bags out to maintain them, they're heavy. We don't want a lot of sediment down there. We'll never be able to get them out. Engineers are all saying, no, we need to get everything, everything. So this was what I call the line of collaboration, right? So maintenance got what they wanted, big holes on top. So there's only going to be a certain amount of heavy sediment that gets collected. And engineering got what they want because they got a lot of sediment control. And, you know, unless it really fills up, they're probably going to get a majority of what they wanted to get. So this made it to where maintenance now can just pop the top, take that out, no more feet in the street, and it's customizable. Remember what I said, all these things could change, and they all, changed based on what Philadelphia wanted. So that was part of the program. The other part of the program was introducing a new bag. So I showed you that bag. They had a single layer bag. They were replacing those bags about once a year. When maintenance would pull that out of the hole, they would drag it across the ground to dump it in their garbage can or dump it in their pickup truck, and the bags were getting holes in them. So we came up with this three-piece design, much more durable bag. You can see that we increased life expectancy from 1 year to 2 to 3. So basically cut their budget by about 50 to 75%. And everybody was really, really happy. We did this again through collaboration with the maintenance team, telling us about their challenges, the engineers, the product specialists, us at Ferguson, and then we pulled one of our manufacturing partners in to help us figure out how to craft and design these things. So again, customizing a solution to meet their needs, thinking about maintenance and what's going to make maintenance easier for everybody. Okay. So this was their final product line. Again, this was that little filter I showed you earlier. This was their Green Filter Highway. This won a really cool award from the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia for like innovative product. I really think it was cool to see all the parties come together. I think they should have got an award for collaboration because it's rare to see the maintenance team actually be included in some of these conversations, but they got a ton of knowledge and can probably help with some of these things. So now let's switch gears. Let's go to New York City. We get a call from New York City and they say, hey, we need filters for pretreatment. We go, we got this thing whipped. We just got done solving all Philadelphia's problems. We got your perfect solution. And we went there and this is what we saw. Remember what I said earlier, no two cities are alike. Everyone's challenges are different. So these are what they call infiltration pits. This is their pretreatment for the infiltration pit. And this is what they look like. Disgusting. These are all over New York City and the 5 boroughs. So what they said was, we don't care about sediment, not our problem. We care about all that nasty trash, right? So this is what we developed for them. Some interesting challenges here, very old infrastructure. You can't just buy a filter off the shelf and pop it in there. They had to create some interesting ways to get this thing to lock in. Again, we were able to do that with our manufacturing partner. They wanted something that was going to be more permanent. They didn't want a filter bag. They wanted something that was made of stainless steel, aluminum, not going to have to replace it. And look at these big old holes. They don't care about sediment. Sediment, have fun, go down the drain. We need to capture trash. That accomplished that. So again, another example of a city with a pretreatment problem. This one specifically for green infrastructure, 2 totally different goals. All these things can be customized, again, thinking about what maintenance is. I just want to mention, how do these things get maintained? Most of those you pull out and you dump them and then you put them right back in. But if you're a city that has dozens, hundreds of these things, which Philadelphia is one of them, it may make more sense to use something like a vac truck where you just pop that manhole lid, you vacuum the inside of it out, and then you put the lid back on. So that may not be easy with maybe an inexpensive bag like I showed you initially, but for some of these more durable stainless steel, aluminum type products, this is traditionally how they're maintained. And then to tie that back in a little bit to green infrastructure, pretreatment's not just for drains. Pretreatment is also for green assets like rain gardens, right? There's so many different options to use, but check out how these work. They literally sit right in the curb line. When that rain enters that facility, now I'm grabbing, all the trash, all the debris, the floatables, leaves, and everything in one centralized place. And I'm not grabbing it all out from here. So sediment that normally clog up rain gardens or bioswales, capturing it in pretreatment. All I got to do is pop that lid, scrape out the debris, put the lid back on, have a nice day. That's a permanent asset, and it makes maintenance so much simpler. So just something to think about. I kind of want to tie that inlet protection back into green infrastructure. And now let's switch gears. Staying with New York City, but talking about maintenance and the big challenge they had with these rain gardens, right? And maintaining these things. I showed you the infiltration pit, which basically this is sod, and down below that is just all stone. So that's operating like a storage facility. But then they've also got these types of rain gardens here with no pre-treatment, right? So dirt, debris, trash goes into these things, and they got to maintain them. Something very interesting happened during COVID. New York City said, we are, streets are closed, the roads are a lot less busy. We're going to install rain gardens. We're going to install a lot of them, like 1,000 of them across the 5 boroughs. Every single one of these green dots represent a rain garden. And they put all these things in like a couple of years. Awesome. Guess what they didn't think about? And by the way, neither did we. Each one of those boxes represents a maintenance crew. In order for them to maintain these thousands of rain gardens that they put in, they had to hire 11 maintenance crews, each consisting of 3 human beings. How'd you like to put that onto your budget after you think you're doing something proactive for your city? They realized really quickly, no more rain gardens, but we need green infrastructure. What are we going to do? That's when we introduced this. Yep, I am. Don't leave me alone. I'm afraid to hit this button, but I'm going to do it. Okay. This is when we went to this porous pavement. Still green infrastructure, porous surface, but they found it way easier to maintain. Okay, so when we talk about permeable surfaces, few things to consider when you're designing for maintenance. Number one, I like to tell everyone, these are alternative inlets. You're not checking a box because the city told you to put in some impervious pavement. No, use these things like assets, right? You can get a lot of water off the surface in some really cool spaces. And you can do that by running water or directing water to them, okay? One thing that I always tell folks to consider, run-on ratios. In a perfect world, 1 square foot of pervious surface would receive 1 square foot of impervious run-on, a 1-to-1 ratio. The worse that ratio gets, in other words, if it's 2-to-1 or 5-to-1, you're sending a lot of water to a really small area, and that's when things get clogged with sediment, debris, things of that nature. So I like to see run-on ratios 5-to-1, 5 at the most, but I'm happier in the 3-to-1 range. Sometimes cost doesn't allow that to happen, but that's one thing to consider. Higher your ratio, the more maintenance you'll need. A lot of grants pay for construction, not maintenance. Maybe think about increasing your impervious area. It'll reduce the amount of time or the number of times you have to maintain it every year. What's around? Look around. What's water is coming to the site? Most common pervious pavement or permeable surface killer, sand, silt. So if you've got unvegetated areas around, and when it rains, it's putting all that sand and all that debris onto your permeable surface, odds are you're going to have to maintain it more. So pay attention to what's coming around. Use vegetated buffers, in other words, grassed areas or things like that, as much as possible. And consider alternatives. You're about to see something that's pretty unique that you may not have seen before, but there's all kinds of neat stuff. This here is a plastic grid product that you can put soil and grow grass or put rock in it. I think it looks really nice. And guess what? The water just disappears when it hits it. So consider things that aren't maybe porous asphalt or porous concrete, which have been those historic or traditional products. So here's New York City. And I love this concept. New York City, basically, they have a combined sewer overflow. So they said, we do not want stormwater going into that system. How do we keep the water out of the pipes? Well, these are porous concrete panels. Notice the lines in them. I'll get into that a little bit more, but basically on the curb line, they're putting these things in. They're about 4 feet wide. Garbage trucks run over them all day long, dump trucks, you name it, doesn't matter. But they did this because remember the 11 maintenance crews I showed you? Now they've only got 1. One other thing we did on this project, here's the porous concrete panel. There's a stone base that provides support so that it can take a full traffic load. And this one was pretty cool because we put underground storage in it. Remember what I said, New York City, keep the water out of our CSO, combined sewer overflow. They want as much storage in a small area as they could get. And these underground detention products, particularly this one, give us 90% void space. Stone typically gives us 4%. So this is what the detail looks like. This is how they maintain it. And I absolutely love this. So it's just a vac truck, but they've created this little attachment that sits off to the side. There's one human being in this truck maintaining miles of porous gutter line every day by himself, one human, not 11 maintenance crews times 3 people. So this was a much simpler maintenance plan. This is something they could really wrap their arms around. They understood this, and it made it so much simpler for them to maintain. I'll take just a sec to talk about porous pavement maintenance. There's lots of different options here. This was a really neat vehicle I saw at a municipality down here. It's on a Bobcat chassis. It's got 500 gallons of water back here, and this is the vacuum. I liked it because it could really get into like on-street parking pretty easy. It can get up on a sidewalk really easy. There's big trucks. There's walk-behind equipment like you see right here. This was actually a test facility at a university. They clogged it up, seeing if they could make it fail and then bring it back to life, which they did. So there's a bunch of different technologies out there. I like to provide pricing. This is in Florida. Please understand this isn't going to reign true everywhere. But again, I like to quell that fear or squash that fear of like, oh, it's so expensive to take care of. I mean, if you've got a huge parking lot, some people are only paying 25 cents a square foot. You know, if you got smaller areas and there's traffic and it goes up, but I mean, built in, it's not that expensive to take care of. So anyway, this is how you maintain that stuff. Again, this is what one of those porous concrete panels looks like. I love it because it's pre-manufactured in a facility. It comes with a warranty. It's really simple to put down on the ground. It takes a full traffic load. It's super versatile. So you can see we use them around curb lines. Why do we put them here? Notice how it's just there. Have you ever walked in the street and seen just a gigantic duck puddle, bird bath right there? It's dangerous for pedestrians and it's also dangerous for cars. This gives the water somewhere to go. Sidewalks, we're seeing it more and more. These panels are already built like the width of a sidewalk. And then green alleyways. This is a really cool retrofit thing that we're starting to see in cities and counties. And this product works great going right down the middle of that. So unique ways to use it. This is that puddling issue I was talking about. So this was a municipality that had a parking lot that was 30 years old. Historically, the ground had just settled and they would either have to regrade and repave this whole thing or hit the right button, cut out a section of that asphalt and put a few of these panels in. And now the water doesn't sit there anymore. You can see how dirty this was. This was actually after a hurricane here in Cocoa Beach, Florida. But easy to vacuum, easy to maintain. This thing was put in 5 years ago, and these residents are still high and dry and thankful as they could be. So as I wrap things up, just a kind of final thoughts here. Collaboration is critical to the success of projects. Get as many people involved as you can. Get different perspectives, talk things through, and try and come up with what's best for your particular project. Maintenance has to be a part of the conversation. Any green infrastructure asset you put in, if you don't maintain it, I can promise you it's not going to work long term. Talk maintenance. If you can't afford maintenance or you don't have the assets for maintenance, don't put the green infrastructure in because you're probably going to be left with a sour taste in your mouth. Pre-treatment is a common theme with all the cities that we see with great maintenance programs and maintaining the long-term or the longevity of their assets. So things like pre-treating before rain gardens, inlet protection for your gray and green infrastructure, being smart about how you design your permeable or porous surfaces, all really important. Every city and county is unique, as I talked about. So don't think just one solution is going to solve all problems. And last but not least, collaboration doesn't happen by accident. My dog's cheering on collaboration, by the way, one of the joys of working from home these days. Sorry, but collaboration doesn't happen by accident. You got to choose. So be that change leader. Be that person that says, hey, did we talk to maintenance about how they're going to manage this? Did we think about how we're going to take care of this long term? Be that change champion and collaborate with others. I think it's really important. And with that, I am done. I mentioned being a Floridian. This is my lovely wife and I down in the Keys again, actually. It probably was on that same trip. enjoying the water and continuing to do that as often as possible. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, and hopefully there'll be a few questions.
Chris, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. It reminds me of what they're doing in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles River, in terms of taking former concrete infrastructure, we all know from TV movies, and certain sections of it, putting in miles of essentially green space.
Yep.
So let's open the webinar to questions. You can use the chat feature, submit a question, and I'll read the question to Chris, or if you prefer, unmute yourself, state your name and company, and ask the question directly. Remember to remute yourself after you finish. And let's go with this first question. Chris, can green infrastructure practices be used to manage stormwater runoff if the soils of my project site do not infiltrate?
Yeah, great question. And I kind of alluded to that earlier. So my answer to that is yes. It's a bit more expensive, but my answer is still yes. Because if you think about green infrastructure in general, what we're trying to do is take post-development condition and bring it to pre-development conditions. So that means when it rains and rains and rains, we want to try and hang on to that water. So if you don't have infiltrative soils, a rain garden, I would then pair that rain garden with some type of a detention system, whether it be like I showed you the porous pavement, for example. All porous pavements are going to have some sort of a stone base below them, which is a reservoir. It's holding water. So it rains really hard. That reservoir holds the water. It's not going to infiltrate, but guess what? No water's running off the site. It's getting the water off the surface. And then when the rain event stops, much like a detention basin or a pond that lets water go really slowly, you can then start to let that water go at a more controlled rate. So rather than have that huge first flush of dirty, untreated water that just leaves your site, you've got all these small retention, sort of detention areas where you're holding onto that water. It's not infiltrating. Rain event stops. And now through orifices or through different things, we can slowly let that water go. It is more expensive, don't get me wrong, because you probably have to add rock again, or you've got to add maybe some underground storage for storing all that water that does not infiltrate, but it's possible. We just want to get back to a condition where we slow down the flow of water. Hopefully that makes sense.
Are there other questions? If you have them, please go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can certainly unmute yourself. Chris, here's one. What maintenance practices should be considered when using inlet protection?
Yeah, first and foremost, who is going to actually pop the lid? Take care of them. That's, I'd say, the first and foremost. Typically, if you're a private development site or you're a private landowner, there's lots of different stormwater maintenance companies that'll come out and inspect, say, your pond on your property, or maybe your bioretention system. Those historic or conventional stormwater BMPs. So typically, those companies will have a service where they can come out, take that grid or grate off of your inlet, and pull that bag out or pull that basket out and dump it, put it back, or vacuum it out, one or the other. If you're a municipality, do you have humans that can actually go around and pull those lids off and take care of that? Or do you have a third-party service? Many municipalities may own a stormwater vacuum truck because it's something that they already have to maintain other assets. Could that be used? So people, and then if you don't have those, do you have money? Do you have allocated, can you budget and allocate a budget to set aside to say, look, we know these things are going to fill up with leaves, trash, debris, which means they're going to need to be cleaned out and maintained. How much is that going to cost? How often do I have to do that? I think that's really important too. If I have a drain that's in the middle of a city with tons and tons of trees and leaf canopy versus a city that has a drain and there's not a single tree around, or it's all palm trees, which one do you think is going to need to be maintained more often? So maintenance doesn't look the same for every site. As I said, not one site is the same. So you really got to think about frequency of maintenance. How much is it going to cost? Do I have the human resources to take care of it? Incidentally, I didn't mention it, but in every single one of those inlet protection or inlet filters I showed you, there's going to be bypass. So if that thing were to fill up completely with sediment, debris, garbage, you name it, there's always a way for the water to get out so that it doesn't clog the drain. So even when those things don't get maintained, you're not creating flooding because you clog that drain. That's really important. I should have mentioned that earlier, but I would say those are the things to consider for inlet protection maintenance.
Chris, here's a question. what maintenance practices should be considered when using pervious pavement?
Yeah, great question. So I would say, the size obviously is going to be one thing, but frequency. How often is it going to need to be maintained? Trying to find something fun on my desk here. If you think about like this being a parking lot, and let's say your entire parking lot were covered with pervious area. Remember I said runoff. Where's the sediment coming from? Sediment's going to come from vegetated areas that maybe aren't vegetated anymore. So the sediment's going to start clogging your system on the edges. If you've got a big wide open parking lot and just tree canopy and there's not a lot of sediment run on, you may not need to maintain that thing, maintain it meaning vacuum it, but every 5 years or something. Let's say different story, everything around your parking lot is sand and dirt and old vegetation that hasn't been maintained, and every time it rains, sand and debris just comes onto this thing. Probably going to need to be maintained monthly, bi-month, maybe every 6 months. So what is contributing? What dirt and debris is coming onto it? The other thing to think about too is, remember what I said, typically where the dirt and debris is running on, that's going to clog first. So maybe you put a plan in place to say, hey, you know what, we're going to maintain the outer edges where all the debris and the dirt is coming and running onto our site versus budgeting to have to vacuum the entire surface every single time. So what is running onto your site? Big consideration. What equipment do you have available? If you're looking at something very popular these days are these green street projects where, you took a 4-lane highway, you cut it down to 2 lanes. All that parking that was created, we love putting porous or permeable surfaces there because now you're creating new inlets. You created a beautiful new parking spot. It looks gorgeous. And oh, by the way, it now takes stormwater runoff. How do you maintain those when cars are parked in them? Pretty challenging. So do you have to perform maintenance overnight? Do you have to perform maintenance early in the morning? Do you have to shut part of those parking spaces down to maintain and access those things? So I would say for streetscape projects, consider when are those spaces going to be open. That can also affect the type of equipment. That piece of equipment I showed you for New York City, that was a simple add-on to their leaf vacuuming machine. But is that going to fit in a parking spot? Probably not, right? You may need to switch to something like a walk-behind unit or maybe like that little Bobcat thing that I showed you. So I'd say, what's your site look like? What debris is around? And then you can start to build out, how much is that going to cost? For New York City, they maintain those gutter lines twice a year. They're on a regular schedule. One could argue it could be done more. They've got to drive that machine a little bit slower, maybe blow a little more water down in there to agitate and pull some of that sediment out. But that's their plan. They said, you know what, if we're going down this road, we know how much the truck is, we know how much the operator is, twice a year, everywhere is going to get touched. So I'd say those are your biggest factors.
Are there any other questions? Hearing not, thank you everyone for your questions. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. Chris, thank you very much for your time today to present this absolutely fascinating information to our guests. Today's webinar is recorded. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the NUCA.com website and on our YouTube channel over the next few days. And thank you for your time today to join us for this special history webinar and for supporting NUCA. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.